from Africa.com, Soko Sibia, coming to you live from Davos, Switzerland at the WEF annual meeting for 2022. Join Teresa Clarke from Africa.com, who sat down with Borge Brende, the president of the World Economic Forum, as well as the CEO of Standard Bank, Tshabalala, to talk about how Africa's governments and large companies can tackle climate change issues, environmental, social, and governance issues.
Hello, this is Teresa Clarke. I'm the CEO and executive editor of Africa.com. Today, we have the distinct privilege to sit down with Borge Brende, the president of the World Economic Forum. How are you today, Borge?
No, thank you so much. It's been a good day so far. A lot of work now in the run-up to our annual meeting in Davos.
Yes, I'm sure you're very happy that it's finally here. Now, let's turn to ESG. Do you think that the ESG framework that's been developed largely in Europe and the US can be adopted in the same way in Africa?
I think Africa is already a leader on many of these areas. For me, the ESG is putting environment, social inclusion, and also governance at the core is something that benefits companies. You know, sometimes it's looked at, oh, this is like something that will reduce the profit of the company. No, it's quite the contrary. The cost of inaction far exceeds the cost of action. If you do well in the green transition, but also in inclusiveness and good governance, anti-corruption work, your company will do much better. And in a time of talentism, the most talented young people would like to work for companies that are setting a good standard, that don't only care about their those that own the company, but also those that work in the company and for the company and for society at large.
Now, let's talk specifically about carbon. And given that Africa contributes only about 2% to the global carbon footprint, should it be allowed to catch up on its use of natural gas, for example, in order to close the gap on its need for energy in order to meet the Sustainable Development Goals?
So in all the thinking around climate change, there has also been an approach that is common but differentiated obligations. At the same time, though, Africa is probably the continent worst hit by climate change, and it's the continent that has, as you alluded to, contributed the least to climate change. A continent of more than 1 billion people and only contributed 2% of the CO2 emissions. So, of course, in some areas, Africa will continue to grow. Natural gas that do emit half of what, for example, coal does. But I think we also need, also in Africa, to try to decouple economic growth from growth in CO2 emissions, because Africa is also should be a leader in the renewable field. And Africa has huge opportunities, both when it comes to solar, when it comes to wind, when it's also come to hydro. So I'm optimistic that this green energy transition can create a lot of jobs and also is an opportunity for Africa.
Can you tell us what role should financial institutions in Africa play to ensure that Africa does make progress on climate change?
Financial institutions should look favorably at investments in the green transition. I think it's also good for the banks and financial institutions to be financing the new renewables, because one thing is good for the planet, but I think it's also, with the current energy prices, many of the projects that were expensive in the past and were maybe not profitable, they suddenly become very, very profitable. And over time, I think we have to be very much aware that energy is about three things. It's energy access, it's energy security, and then it's decoupling energy growth from growth in CO2 emissions. And energy poverty is a big thing in Africa. There are a lot of people that don't even have access to basic electricity. And we should make sure, and this is not only African financial institutions, it's the World Bank, it's IMF, it's also other financial institutions should step up and contribute to energy access and fight energy poverty in Africa, but we should fight it with freedom fuels and renewable fuels.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with Africa.com and all of our business publishing partners across the African continent.
That was Borge Brende, the president of the World Economic Forum, talking to Africa.com's Teresa Clarke. Now let's head over to Tshabalala, the CEO of Standard Bank, who will be addressing the same issues as Borge.
So, Sim, thank you very much for joining us during this rescheduled week of the World Economic Forum at Davos.
Teresa, it's a real privilege to be with you, and it's been a long time since we spoke, so I'm looking forward to our conversation. It's a real privilege. Thank you very much.
So today, we've had a chance also to talk to Borge Brende about ESG in Africa, and he's answered a few questions. We'd like you to get your perspective as a CEO of the largest bank in Africa, who's taking a leading role on ESG and climate change. We thought that we would be privileged to get your unique perspective from where you sit on these same exact questions. So the first question I have is, do you think that the ESG framework as developed in Europe and the US can be adopted in the same form in Africa?
Teresa, that's a fundamental question, right? That's where it all starts and begins. And I would want to start by affirming that the concepts of environmental sustainability, positive social contribution, and good governance are as applicable on our beloved continent as they are anywhere else in the world. I think it would be wrong to start to argue, for example, that it's acceptable for businesses on our continent to cut corners, right? Just because people in the developed markets have a tough time, it's just not appropriate for anybody to argue that they should be in a position to cut corners. And that's certainly not what we would argue for. In fact, Teresa, you would know this. In South Africa, the broad rubric of corporate governance is determined by a code known as the King 4 Code. So all companies listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange are obliged to comply with the King Code. And as a South African, I'm proud to tell you that it's one of the world's most developed and demanding corporate governance standards in the world. And it focuses our minds on good governance and positive social outcomes. But as is implicit in what I'm arguing, I think, the E in ESG, I think, is different from the S and the G. Certainly in the developed world, one would make that argument very strongly, and I'd like to do that in this conversation. So speaking for myself, I really can't think of any reason why the S and the G would be less demanding on the continent, so that is granted. In fact, Teresa, on our continent, the demand for better social action and better social contribution, reducing poverty and inequality, but then having strong governance is a very strong argument for world best practice, so that is granted. But on the E bit, we think it's different. And that difference is recognized by international law. For one, the Paris Agreement makes it crystal clear that the international legal obligations of the developing countries are definitely different from those of the developed ones. So in the case of the first world or the developed countries, they are required to reduce their carbon intensity as well as making sure that their growth paths must lower absolute output of carbon. But definitely, as far as developing countries go, where we are, the law requires us to reduce our carbon intensity, the carbon intensity of our growth, rather than just lower the absolute output of carbon, which, as I say, is what developed countries are required to do. So it is important to say that Africa hasn't made a huge contribution to global warming, but in fact, by a cruel irony, we're going to suffer the biggest vulnerabilities as a result of the negative effects from global warming. So while we must join, like everybody globally, in limiting greenhouse gas emissions, that imperative has to be considered in the context of a just transition. And the fact here is that fewer than 50% of the people in sub-Saharan Africa have access to electricity. And so in making demands in respect of environmental obligations, they have to go hand in glove with a social commitment, particularly the protection of jobs. And in fact, as I close on this question, Teresa, the World Bank has also said, we need to contemplate the financing of brown activities in the continent as we think about transitioning. And we think that that's right. But I've got no doubt that we must contribute to the reduction of our reliance on carbon for energy. We should decarbonize, but we should do so in the context of a just transition. Thank you, Teresa.
Very, very helpful perspective, very comprehensive response. Thank you for sharing such a global view on this topic with us. So thank you for that. You clearly have a perspective with which to understand the critical nature of these questions as they relate to Africa and the multiple objectives that must be addressed. So that's very helpful. So we're going to stick for a moment to the topic of the environmental in ESG. And so as Africa contributes only about 2% to the global carbon footprint, do you think that Africa should be allowed to catch up, as it were, on its use of natural gas in order to close the gap on its need for energy in order to meet the SDGs?
So, Teresa, we have got a very, very clearly defined climate policy, which dictates our approach to gas, and we're very proud of it. And to be very firm and direct with you, we view gas as an entirely legitimate transition fuel for our continent. We see gas as central and key to balancing economic development and social upliftment, the point we were making earlier on when we were discussing your first question. We need to take account of the reduction of global emissions, but help to facilitate the switch from high-emitting energy sources like wood and coal, which are ubiquitous on the continent, to lower carbon fuels. And in that context, that replacement is by way of liquefied petroleum gas for cooking and natural gas for the provision of baseload energy. And this is appropriate on the continent. And our commitment at Standard Bank to gas financing is driven by the science. It's based on the emissions and development plans that are appropriate to the key markets, driven by the legal and governance regulations of those relevant markets, as well as the pathways for our continent that are calculated to support the global targets with which we agree. But we also take account of the NGFS Net Zero 2050 scenario, which is very clear that gas demand is going to continue until 2050. So we'll continue to finance gas responsibly, and we'll do so over the medium term, given the demands and the needs of the African continent. However, clearly our financing will be reviewed regularly, and we will look at the technological developments that are happening and stay in touch with them. And we're going to reduce and try to reduce emissions intensity while managing our gas exposure. And in our policy, we've made certain commitments, and let me just raise 3 or 4 of them. First, we're going to finance gas-related projects that have 0 to minimal fugitive emissions, or that are committed to a pathway that reduces carbon intensity associated with liquefied natural gas plants. Second, we're going to prioritize finance for the construction of gas-fired power plants when one of two conditions prevail. First, where you're providing support services as part of an integrated renewable energy power solution, or on the other hand, where you're converting existing coal or oil-fired power plants as part of a clearly defined decarbonization plan, which is aligned to net zero by 2050. I think the third thing here is we're going to want to limit financing of standalone gas-fired power plants, providing general baseload, mid-merit or peaking power, and we're going to limit those to a cap of 0.75% of our total advances after 2026, and that comes from a current level of 0.14 of advances. And lastly, on this point, Teresa, we're going to reduce exposure to gas by 2045 in line with our commitment to net zero by 2050, while giving due consideration to the energy security of the markets in which we operate. And that differs from East Africa to West Africa and to Southern Africa. Thank you, Teresa.
Well, clearly a well thought through plan. I can see that there's been much consideration put into this in order to be responsible corporate citizens across the continent and the world. So I'm very pleased to learn about your leadership in this space.
Thank you.
My last question for you, you've touched a little bit on this already, but let me just ask it, and that is, what role do you think that financial institutions should play in ensuring that Africa makes progress on climate change?
Teresa, a very important point, and I would want to simply say this, that we would say will play a major part, but not the only part. And that's quite an important principle to establish. And I think when answering this question, it's always important to remember what the role of a financial institution is. And we don't allocate resources in isolation and at will, because we're a derived industry, right? We lend and invest in response to what the market asks of us, what the market demands are, and also dictated by the regulatory environment. And of course, both of those vectors are driven by social and political preferences in the countries where you operate. Another way of putting this is to say that civil society, individuals, our communities can make a huge difference by choosing more suitable products and services on the one hand, and by voting for politicians who place a high priority on mitigating climate change. Those change preferences and those rule changes that happen, once they've happened, then financial institutions will follow. The next point in this context would be to say, as Africa's largest financial services business, and as a business, large bank that's committed to promoting inclusive and sustainable development on our continent, we feel compelled to act responsibly to mitigate the climate change crisis, and we'll do so by reducing our carbon intensity, the carbon intensity of our growth, and by taking several other actions. And let me just rattle through a few. Firstly, our core business activities are being directed towards Africa's development challenges and towards maximizing opportunities for sustainable and inclusive growth, while also managing the risks posed by climate change. Second, our climate policy sets out our group's progressive short, medium, and long-term targets, which, as I say, are informed by science. Third, we've committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions from our own operations by 2040 and from our portfolio of financed emissions by 2050, again, aligned to the Paris Agreement. The next point to consider is that we'll reduce our financed emissions and simultaneously scale up our financing of renewables, the proliferation of reforestation, looking at climate smart agriculture, focusing on decarbonization and transition technologies, and of course by supporting the development of credible carbon offset programs. Next, a point to remember, Teresa, is that our bank is already a major funder of renewable energy projects. Since 2012, 86% of our new energy lending has been to renewable energy. And we've not financed any new coal-fired power stations since 2009. So in conclusion, the transition away from non-renewable energy will necessarily be a gradual and measured process. It'll be dialectical, and that is so given the widespread energy poverty across the continent, where less than 43% of our population has access to a national grid. I mean, it's staggering at this stage of human development. In our climate policy, we commit to achieving net zero carbon emissions with commitments for specific actions in relation to oil and thermal coal. And as I say, and as you can tell, we're very proud of that well thought out policy. Thank you, Teresa.
Well, thank you, Sim, for just a very informative interview on a topic that is so important at the World Economic Forum Davos this week, but at Africa 365 days of the year, understanding ESG as it's being practiced by one of the largest players on the continent. Your perspective is clearly very well informed, very well analyzed, thought through, and respective of the people and the planet. And so our opportunity to hear from you on this topic really rounds out our understanding, and we're very appreciative of you taking the time during this very busy week to share these thoughts with us. Thank you so much.
Teresa, thank you very much, and it was a real privilege to be with you, and it's great to be part of a conversation with Borge as well. Thank you.
That was a fantastic conversation from two very thoughtful leaders and pioneers of climate change and how it affects the African continent. Thank you for joining us, and once again, happy Africa Day.